there, I am back for a very short final video on vessel physiology. I meant to keep this on the previous video and I hit the wrong button and I ended the recording of the previous video, so we're just going to record it here as a short, 5 to 10 minute video to finish things up. And what I wanted to do is I wanted to go over to the notes here, and I wanted to just kind of go through these, and if there was something that I didn't actually comment on, I wanted to kind of add it. So the first thing you're going to see is the hormones that I talked about in the previous video. The adrenal medulla. There's all sorts of things about the targets and the effects. The atrial natriuretic peptide and its effects. Antidiuretic hormone and its effects. I'm going to come back to these in just a second. I'm purposely skipping a couple things. Aldosterone, right, which we talked about, working opposite of that ANP. Okay, and then here is a more detailed explanation or an approximation of the same level that I went into of the angiotensin mechanism. Okay, so and we'll come back and talk about that also in a second. And so this goes through that whole process and talks about angiotensin, which we did, angiotensin 1 and angiotensin 2. Okay, and that's where we're going to stop for this lecture. Now, let's go back. There were a couple things that I didn't talk about in the in my previous video, and so I just want to add one or two things. So endothelium-derived factors are chemicals that are released from the endothelium. Remember, the endothelium is the layer of the part that touches the blood, the innermost layer of our vessels, and then it changes to endocardium in the heart. It's just its name. And these endothelium-derived factors have short-term local effects. So they don't affect the entire body, but they affect vessels locally. Okay, and so there's a couple here: endothelin and PDGF, prostaglandin-derived factor. These target the smooth muscle in the vessel wall, and they vasoconstrict. So they can vasoconstrict locally. Right. So there's one. The other one is nitric oxide, and nitric oxide actually. This does the opposite. So if endothelin here, we'll just underline the most important parts here. Endothelin causes vasoconstriction locally, and we know that'll cause blood pressure to go up. Nitric oxide does the opposite. It targets the same smooth muscle, but it vasodilates, and that will then decrease resistance and then decrease blood pressure. And this is the pathway that's used by Viagra and other drugs that vasodilate. So maybe that makes sense if you know what Viagra's actions are. You can understand why nitric oxide would, that pill will cause a nitric oxide-like effect, which will vasodilate vessels. So that's kind of interesting. Now, alcohol's in here. It is not a hormone, of course, but it acts, has similar effects on or it can act and change blood pressure. And in this case, alcohol increases urine production output by causing ADH not to be released as much. That's one thing it does. And this will lower blood volume and lower blood pressure. This also leads to dehydration, which is one of the problems if someone is drinking a lot of alcohol. They actually, even though they're putting liquid into their body, they're dehydrating themselves, or they can. It also will go to the vasomotor center and cause the sympathetic stimulation to drop. That will also decrease blood pressure. And it can target vessels directly and vasodilate them, which will decrease blood pressure. And we see this sometimes in people who are chronic drinkers. They drink so much that they vasodilate their peripheral vessels so much that those vessels kind of become engorged with blood all the time, and that's kind of like that red nose effect or red cheek effect. Now, some people get this just from a little bit of alcohol, and they get a flushing effect right away and then it goes away. But people who drink all the time, sometimes their vessels kind of permanently vasodilate, and we see kind of this red-skinned effect in their nose or their cheeks or whatnot. Okay, so we talked about aldosterone, and then the renin-angiotensin mechanism. What I wanted to note, which I didn't go into a lot of detail because it's written a little nicer here, is that there's this thing called the juxtaglomerular apparatus. And this is where, and this is right in this area right here. And what it is it's what's kind of deciding whether renin is going to get released. And so there's two things. There's the juxtaglomerular cells in this apparatus and the macula densa cells. Now the macula densa cells are the ones that are right here that are at the distal convoluted tubule densa cells, and these are the ones that are checking for the chemical or osmotic sensation, whether there's enough sodium or not enough sodium. And then the juxtaglomerular cells, these are the ones that are going to release renin. Okay, those are right there, and those combined are and they're going to produce and store prorenin or renin. Okay, and they're going to check, and when there's blood pressure changes, remember that was one of the things. If we see low blood pressure, they can release renin. And then this redescribes angiotensin 1 and angiotensin 2, which I did already for you, but there it is. Okay, so you can read that if we want. We can say the kidneys release renin. That activates angiotensinogen to angiotensin 1, which is a weak vasoconstrictor. It's quickly converted in the lungs to angiotensin 2, a powerful vasoconstrictor, by angiotensin converting enzyme, which we abbreviated as ACE, right? And it also stimulates the adrenal cortex to release aldosterone, and that then reabsorbs sodium and water follows. Okay, so this little bit here just kind of finishes, kind of adds to my notes before, and just kind of highlights a couple things that weren't in those notes about hormonal control and other chemical control like alcohol on the peripheral vessels. So review those, make sure you kind of understand it at that minimal level where we're knowing what the hormone is, what the where it's coming from, and what it does to blood pressure. Get that down really well, and then start going back and learning what are the target cells of these hormones, where do they act, and how do they make blood pressure go up or go down. Okay, great. Thanks. We'll see you next time.